Hades was never the villain that modern culture created. That's the first point that needs to be clear. When you watch movies, series, or play video games, Hades appears as a figure of evil, a cruel god who hates humanity and lives in the underworld plotting against the other gods. This has nothing to do with what the ancient Greeks believed. For them, Hades was one of the most important deities in the pantheon, and the respect they had for him was so great that they avoided even pronouncing his name out loud. It wasn't out of fear of violent punishment or being sent to hell, but because Hades represented something that no one can escape: death and everything that comes after it. Ancient Greece didn't have a religion like the ones we know today, with sacred books or fixed rules about good and evil. The Greeks had myths, stories that were told from generation to generation, and each city could have different versions of the same story. But in all these versions, Hades had a central role. He was one of three brothers who divided the cosmos after defeating the Titans. Zeus got the sky, Poseidon got the seas, and Hades got the underworld. This division wasn't a punishment. Hades wasn't expelled from Olympus for doing something wrong. It was an agreement between brothers, and each one ruled his territory with the same power. What makes Hades special is that he ruled a place where everyone would go without exception. It didn't matter if you were a king, a slave, a hero, or a criminal. When you died, you would go to Hades' realm. That was the absolute rule of the Greek universe. The other gods could be avoided or appeased with offerings and rituals, but Hades was inevitable. Everyone knew that one day they would stand before him, and this created a type of respect that no other god could achieve. Zeus could be powerful, but you might never catch his attention. Aphrodite could be capricious, but you could live without getting involved in matters of love. Hades was different. He was waiting for you, and there was no way to escape. The Greeks avoided speaking the name Hades precisely because of this respect mixed with caution. They used nicknames like Pluto, which means the rich one, because they believed that the earth where the dead were buried also held precious minerals and fertility for crops. Calling Hades the rich one was a way of recognizing that death wasn't just the end, but also part of the cycle that kept life functioning. Seeds needed to be buried to sprout. Bodies returned to the earth and fed new plants. Hades was a guardian of this process, and without him, nothing on the surface could exist. Another reason for the respect was the way Hades administered his realm. Unlike Zeus, who had love affairs everywhere and got involved in constant family fights, Hades was described as fair and balanced. He didn't judge souls alone. That was the job of judges like Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. But he made sure the rules were followed. Those who deserved punishment went to Tartarus. Those who deserved peace went to the Elysian Fields. Most common people stayed in the Asphodel Meadows, a place without great suffering, but also without great joy. Hades didn't invent tortures for fun. He wasn't cruel by nature. He just did his job, which was to maintain order in the world of the dead. This completely contrasts with the modern version of Hades as an antagonist. In the original Greek stories, the real villains were others. Cronus, Hades' father, had devoured his own children. Zeus turned women into animals when he tired of them. Hera persecuted Zeus' lovers with horrible vengeance. Ares encouraged brutal wars just for pleasure. Compared to these gods, Hades was almost reasonable. He rarely left the underworld, rarely interfered in the affairs of the living. And when he did something controversial, like abducting Persephone, the story showed that even this had consequences and rules. Zeus and Demeter had to negotiate with him, and Hades agreed to share Persephone between the world of the living and the dead for half the year. He wasn't an absolute tyrant. This respect also came from something very practical. The Greeks believed that disrespecting Hades could bring bad luck not just to you, but to your entire family. If you died without receiving the correct funeral rituals, your soul would wander unable to enter Hades' realm. This was considered a fate worse than any punishment, because it meant being trapped between two worlds, without peace and without place. That's why even enemies killed in battle received some kind of funeral respect. Leaving a body to rot without ceremony was a serious offense, not just against the dead, but against Hades. Now let's talk about fear, because respect and fear walked together when the subject was Hades. But it wasn't the fear that Hades would attack you or chase you. It was the existential fear that he represented the total unknown. Nobody returned from his realm to tell what it was really like there. The myth spoke of heroes like Orpheus, Hercules, and Theseus who descended to the underworld and returned, but these were rare exceptions, and even then they only succeeded because they had divine help. For the common person, death was an absolute mystery, and Hades was a guardian of this mystery. This type of fear isn't very different from what people feel today when they think about their own death. Nobody knows exactly what happens after, and this creates an anxiety that crosses cultures and eras. The difference is that the Greeks transformed this fear into ritualized respect. They made offerings, built temples, told stories that gave shape to the unknown. Hades was a personification of a universal truth, and recognizing this seriously was part of being an adult in that society. There's an interesting detail about how Hades was worshipped. He had few temples compared to other gods, not because he was less important, but because people preferred not to call his attention frequently. It was as if there was a tacit agreement. You live your life on the surface, under the protection of Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and when your time comes, Hades will take care of you. You don't need to keep reminding him of this all the time. Rituals for Hades happened mainly during funerals and on specific occasions linked to the fertility of the earth. This respectful distance was part of the worship of him. Compare this with how people today deal with death. Modern culture tries to hide death as much as possible. Distant hospitals, discreet wakes, cemeteries in the corners of cities. Nobody wants to talk about dying, and when someone dies, the reaction is to treat it as if it were something abnormal, shocking, unfair. The Greeks saw death as a natural part of existence, and Hades as a necessary part of the system. They didn't try to pretend that death didn't exist. They looked straight at it and said, "This is a force that deserves respect." This attitude has much to teach. Today, people live trying to avoid any thought about the end, and this creates a type of chronic anxiety. You become obsessed with eternal youth, with accumulating experiences before it's too late, with leaving a legacy on social media because you're afraid of being forgotten. The Greeks accepted that they would be forgotten by most people, but that this didn't matter so much. What mattered was living according to certain principles, fulfilling your social and family obligations, and when the time came, going to Hades' realm without huge regrets. Hades was also respected because he represented final justice. In life, many things were unfair. Bad people had good lives. Good people suffered. But the Greeks believed that in the underworld, accounts were settled. The judges evaluated your entire life, not just your last moments. This created a value system where your actions had real weight, even if nobody was watching. You didn't act right just to avoid punishment from the Olympian gods, but because you knew that eventually you would have to face Hades' judgment. This concept of post-death justice profoundly influenced other religions that came later. Christianity, for example, took elements of this idea and transformed it into heaven and hell with stricter rules. But in the Greek version, things were more nuanced. There wasn't a universal hell where all sinners went. There were different levels of punishment and reward based on what you had done. Tartarus was reserved for the worst crimes, especially those against the gods. The Elysian Fields were for heroes and exceptionally virtuous people. Most stayed in the middle ground of the Asphodel Meadows, an existence without brilliance but without torture. This structure showed that the Greeks thought about morality in a complex way. They didn't believe in absolute good and evil. They believed in balance and consequences, and that each action generated a reaction. Hades was the guardian of this final balance. He was a moral judge in a modern sense, but he guaranteed that the system worked, and this required respect. One of the most well-known stories about Hades is the abduction of Persephone. Modern versions treat this as a pure and simple kidnapping, painting Hades as a villain. But in the ancient versions, the story had layers. Persephone was a daughter of Demeter, goddess of agriculture, and lived on the surface. Hades fell in love with her and, with Zeus' permission, took Persephone to the Underworld. Demeter was devastated and stopped making the earth produce, causing a terrible famine. Zeus then negotiated a deal. Persephone would stay half the year with Hades and half with Demeter. This explained the seasons. When Persephone was in the underworld, it was winter. When she returned to the surface, it was spring and summer. What this story shows isn't Hades' cruelty, but how he was also subject to the rules of the cosmos. He couldn't simply do what he wanted. He had to negotiate, make deals, accept limits. And Persephone, in many versions, eventually becomes queen of the underworld with her own power, not just a prisoner. She rules alongside Hades, and in some stories, even helps lost souls find peace. The relationship between the two evolves from a problematic beginning to a partnership that maintains the balance between life and death. This nuance is completely lost in modern adaptations. Hollywood needs clear villains and clear heroes. But Greek mythology didn't work that way. The gods were complicated, had flaws, made questionable decisions, but also had important functions in the universe. Hades was no exception. He did controversial things, but his overall role was to maintain order. Another aspect of respect for Hades came from belief that he controlled the riches of the earth. Gold, silver, precious stones, all of this came from underground, from Hades' realm. That's why the nickname Pluto, which later became the name of a separate Roman god. Miners made offerings to Hades before descending into mines. Merchants who traded precious metals recognized that, ultimately, that wealth came from his domain. This connected Hades not just with death, but with material prosperity. This connection between death and wealth wasn't accidental. The Greeks understood that destruction and creation were parts of the same cycle. For something new to grow, something old had to die. For a city to prosper, its enemies might need to fall. For you to succeed, someone had to fail. Hades represented this uncomfortable truth. He was a constant reminder that everything has a cost. In modern life, people try to completely separate these ideas. They want growth without consequences, success without sacrifice, life without death. But this doesn't work. Every company that grows destroys smaller competitors. Every famous artist stepped over hundreds who didn't make it. Every personal achievement involved leaving other possibilities behind. Hades would be the god who would look at all this and say, yes, that's how it works, and pretending otherwise doesn't change anything. The Greeks weren't afraid to look at these dark aspects of reality. They built stories that recognized the cruelty of the world, but also found ways to live with it. Hades was a central part of this worldview. Respecting Hades was respecting the truth that you don't control everything, that there are forces greater than you, and that one day you will have to face the end. This recognition brought a certain peace. If you accept that you're going to die, you stop spending energy trying to avoid the inevitable and start focusing on what you can control. How you live, what kind of person you are, what kind of legacy you leave for those who remain. The Greeks valued honor, courage, hospitality, family loyalty. These were values that lasted beyond death. Hades couldn't take these things from you. He just received what was left when life ended. There's a huge difference between respect and worship. People worshiped Zeus, held giant festivals for Dionysus, built magnificent temples for Athena. But Hades was respected in a quieter, more personal way. You didn't need a huge temple to recognize that death exists. It was enough to live knowing that it was there, waiting, and that when your turn came, you would be treated according to what you had done. This difference between respect and worship also appears today. People worship celebrities, brands, political ideologies. They throw themselves completely into these modern cults, but they rarely respect the fundamental forces of life: time, nature, mortality, consequences of their own actions. Hades forced people to maintain this respect. He was a reality that couldn't be ignored, no matter how many distractions you created. The Greeks also saw Hades as guardian of boundaries. Between life and death, there's a border that shouldn't be crossed lightly. When heroes descended to the underworld, there was always a price to pay. Orpheus almost rescued Eurydice, but looked back at the last moment and lost her forever. Hercules had to complete an impossible task. Theseus got trapped there until he was rescued. These myths taught that you can't cheat death. You can have brief encounters with it, but you always come back changed, always pay a price. Today, people try to cheat death in various ways: plastic surgery, experimental treatments, cryogenics, uploading consciousness to computers. The promise is always the same: you can live forever if you pay enough or believe enough. But this doesn't work, and deep down everyone knows it. Hades is still there, waiting. Technology can postpone, but it can't eliminate. Another crucial point about Hades was that he had no children. Most Greek gods had offspring, sometimes hundreds of sons and daughters who spread throughout the world, causing problems and adventures. Hades didn't. He and Persephone didn't generate life. This made sense symbolically. Death doesn't create, it only receives. Hades was the end point, not the beginning of anything. And this reinforces his role as an absolute boundary. The sterility of the underworld also appeared in descriptions of the place. There was no sun, no living plants grew. The rivers were made of forgetfulness and lament. It was a place of shadows, of erased memories, of diminished existence. The Greeks didn't fantasize about the underworld as a paradise. Even the Elysian Fields were described as a pale version of real life. The message was clear: enjoy life while you can, because afterwards it's just shadow. This brutal realism about death created pressure to live well now, not in some hypothetical future after death, but now, while you have a body, while you can feel the sun, eat real food, hug people you love. The Greeks didn't believe in an afterlife better than current life. They believed in a diminished continuation, almost a reflection without substance. That's why earthly life mattered so much. Hades was respected because he represented this truth without mercy. He didn't offer false hopes. He didn't promise that everything would get better afterwards. He just governed what came after with impartial justice. And there's something comforting in that, actually, knowing that there's an order, that there are rules even in death, that it's not just total chaos. Greek religion didn't have fixed dogmas about salvation or eternal damnation like later religions developed, but it had Hades as certainty. You will die. You will be judged for your actions. You will receive what you deserve. Simple as that. And precisely because it's simple and inevitable, it deserved the greatest possible respect. What can we take from all this for today? That avoiding thinking about death doesn't make it disappear. That pretending you have total control over your life is an illusion. That respecting forces greater than you that you can't change isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Hades was respected because the Greeks were realistic enough to recognize that some things simply are, regardless of what you think about them. Death is one of those things. And having a figure like Hades to represent this, to give shape to the inevitable, help people deal with this reality without going into panic or complete denial,